Hello everyone and welcome to Memory. This week we are going to talk about how we remember things. It's actually kind of a complicated process and it's pretty imperfect, and we're going to try to highlight some of those issues. So I'm hoping with this video lecture I can keep it more succinct, because I know I love talking about this stuff and I give you too many parts. So I'll try to condense it. But we're going to focus on encoding, storage, and retrieval. So you know back when we talked about cognitive psychologists and your brain is a computer where you type in the input, you save it for later, and then you try to find the saved file and bring it back? That's kind of how our memory works, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So think of that analogy, because memory is going to be the focus of cognitive psychologists. So this is an activity that I do in person, but for comparison for my online students, think of your memory, like a good way to highlight memory is the game Telephone. So when you play Telephone, right, is the message always the same in the beginning of the game as at the end of the line? Usually not. Certain points get emphasized, right? Certain aspects get remembered. Sometimes it's information that, usually is more relative to things that we're interested in. We tend to remember those kind of things that we can self-reference. Or, it depends on the person, but some information gets sharpened, whereas others gets dulled. And so I use this activity, reading a prompt, and we go through the classroom, but unfortunately, we're not in the classroom, so think of it like a game of telephone. So at the same time, you get leveling, that's where more of the information gets left out of the story. Sharpening, where certain details get emphasized. Schemas, we have certain thought patterns and constructs, and how we sometimes rely on those, such as stereotypes. So if I'm telling you a story about a teacher, you may envision a woman, because largely teachers tend to be women. We rely on schemas sometimes to recall information. Our brains are not video cameras. We're trying to reconstruct events, and sometimes we have a way of misconstruing them. We're trying to construct it as we go along. We're trying to reconstruct those events. Think of any time you had a fight with someone and they were like, no, you said this, and you're like, no, I definitely said this. You have an argument about what happened even 5 minutes ago, because our attention to detail or that consciousness can kind of skew what happens and how we reconstruct, like what details we were paying attention to. So what we're going to look at are differences in different types of memory, the memory kind of storage process, strategies to enhance memory, and how we can better our process of retrieval, so getting information that we've learned back out. Because our memory is actually limitless. It's a matter of whether we can retrieve that information at a later time or not. So I've included this video. Check it out in your own time. I'm not going to play a video within a video. But it talks about memory athletes, and this man can recite pi to like the 75,000th number. And he uses very intricate methods using pictures and the way words sound to build a story. All of these memory devices. His brain is not any different than ours. It's just that he's using all these different kinds of tricks and practice, and to get your memory better, you could have the potential to do this. It's all about how you encode that memory. So what cues are you using? Distinctiveness, we're going to talk about all of these features that make memories more salient. So first, let's talk about the information processing model, because I think that's important for understanding memory. In essence, you have a stimuli, and the stimuli enters our sensory memory. Our sensory memory is very brief, like a half a second to 3 seconds. It's when you hear a noise, say I clap my hands in the middle of the lecture, it kind of perks you up, right? Our sensory memory is consistently like a filter. It's filtering in all of these sensory experiences that we are having. And it's a matter of what draws our attention or not. If it draws our attention, it moves to our working memory, which is more like our consciousness, what we're focused on. If we don't draw attention, it gets forgotten. It's like, yeah, there's that buzzing noise in the background, but eventually I get used to it and I'm not paying attention to it anymore. Excuse me, I woke up at 4:30 today. Not a good look for me. So when that goes to our working memory or our present consciousness, whatever we're talking about now, working memory isn't our working memory. We rehearse things to maintain them and elaborate on them. So maybe you're trying to remember a phone number. And this was before we had the phones available, but you'd write it down, or maybe you'd say the number in your head over and over and over again. That is a way to rehearse information in our working memory so that we can remember it and process it, maybe store it for later. Working memory doesn't last very long without rehearsal, but you can maybe remember something 5 to 15 seconds. The rehearsal is an attempt to extend that time that we're working with it, we're chewing on it, so to speak. And so after that, it can be forgotten if not enough attention is paid to it, or if we don't rehearse it properly, or it can be encoded. So when it's encoded, it's put into our long-term memory. Think of that episode of SpongeBob, if y'all watch SpongeBob, where SpongeBob's got the filing cabinets, and he's learning about fine dining, and Squidward says to him, forget everything but fine dining. Fine dining and breathing, right? And it shows SpongeBob having all these file cabinets in his brain. Use that analogy for us. It's kind of like we have filing cabinets in our brain. And when we encode something, we're putting it into those filing cabinets. Now, the way we encode could be, think of it as the way you order your cabinet. Like, how do you want to order that information? You use different cues or clues that kind of help you retrieve it later. So in that long-term memory, let's say 2 weeks from now, you have a test. You go to that long-term memory and you're trying to remember that information. You're giving yourself clues and you're able to retrieve some of that information out, maybe a definition or a concept you want to apply. That moves back to your working memory because now you are actively thinking about it again. Okay? When I ask you who the 44th and 45th presidents of the United States were, you know, you're not thinking about them all the time in your working memory, but after a little while you can recall that information. So in coding, when you first kind of code that information to the long-term memory, it's selective. We attend to some events in our environment and we ignore others. So things that may be threatening, like a loud noise, is something that we're going to tend to. Encoding is prolific. So we consistently encode information. Our brains are working to put that information away and acknowledging the different stimuli occurring around us, the different noises, sights, sounds, tastes, touch, feelings, all that kind of stuff. One thing that's really important for encoding is distinctiveness. This is how something stands out. So if you saw a giraffe walking on campus last week, that's something distinctive. Oop, excuse me, folks. There we go. That's something distinctive. You may remember that if I ask you 2 weeks from now, hey, you know, did you remember seeing that giraffe on campus? You're like, yeah, I saw it on Tuesday in the morning. It was weird. But if I normally ask you what you do on Tuesdays in the morning, you may have trouble recalling that because our days sometimes become a little mundane. We become scheduled. And so it's not very distinctive if things aren't out of the ordinary. So distinctiveness is important for remembering events. Sometimes you have to make something distinctive to remember it. So sometimes I tell my students to take information on a test and reference yourself. You know, make it distinctive. Make it apply to you. Use an example. When we're talking abnormal psychology, use your family. It helps. Recoding is the idea when we learn information, we take it in its given form and change it so that we can make sense of it again. So this is part of the encoding process. So think about the colors of the rainbow, right? If some of you may be able to list red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, right? Well, there's some people who will say Roy G. Biv. Roy G. Biv is an acronym. Yes. That helps us remember the colors of the rainbow by taking the first letter of each color and putting it together to make a sound. That's recoding. You're adding new information, making new associations, right? It can be helpful and it can be harmful. Sometimes it can help us and sometimes it can misconstrue the information a bit. So a lot of these processes can go either way. So how else can we improve our encoding processes? Relating new information to information we already know. So this is great for making like association maps. So when you learn different concepts, like when we talk about those basic paradigms in psychology, those perspectives, when I say cognitive psychology, you have an idea of what relates to cognitive psychology, It talks about the mind and thought processes. Well, now you can add a new concept to connect that of memory. Memory is going to deal with cognitive psychology. Building on this information will definitely help, as well as images, like imagining events or images. So when you're reading, if you imagine things happening in your head, you're more likely to remember them because you're helping expand on that recall ability by giving it more of like a sensory experience and distinctiveness. It's a deeper level of processing. That's the best way to put it. I'm not just remembering surface level words. I'm giving them some context. I'm envisioning them as I read. So those pictures you kind of create in your head can help you. So forming distinctive memories that stand out, that'll help you. Self-reference effect. For example, if you really like Pokemon, and we're talking about childhood disorders or development in childhood, and you want to talk about how Ash Ketchum went out on a journey across the world at 10 years old and how strange that was. You're using an example of something you like to personify a course topic. That's an excellent way to remember our information. So try to use that. And then we have storage. So storage, memories don't get stored in like a specific place. There's this idea that we have memory traces or engrams, but it's not like a cool thing where you can find your embarrassing memory, like here it is on that neuron, let me zap it away, right? There are biochemical changes in our nerve tissue, as we see when synapses communicate, when the neurons communicate across the synapse rather, it makes them stronger, so they're able to convey messages better. This can help with memory and doing other mental processes. So we do see structural changes to our brain, but they're not perfect packages of information. Like, here's the package of your first birthday, here's your first date. Like, we can't specifically find them on the brain. And so when we store that information, it's called consolidation. So these are the neural changes that occur after learning to create the memory trace of an experience. Again, we don't have a specific point to this memory, but it's just the process. There is change to the physical brain. When we remember events, this is really important. We construct them using memory traces and our current beliefs. So, any back in my day story that your parental unit or grandparental unit has ever said to you, they're usually reconstructing the memory and placing their current values on the story. So this comes with, like, sometimes people, like, when they reflect on their high school days, they're like, oh, well, we weren't like those kids nowadays, those Gen Zers with their middle parts. Oh, millennials and Gen Zers, that's the joke now, right? Oh yeah, well, millennials have side parts and skinny jeans, and those are weird, and we have these type of jeans. Whenever people make comparison stories like that, they always add an element of nostalgia to their perspective that makes it seem like better. That's what we say by putting our current values on past experiences. Or when you talk about, like, I'll talk about my high school days. And I'll think, oh, I was this cool kid who wanted to rebel and all this stuff, when really I was just kind of annoying, as all kids are as they're developing in high school. No offense if you're in high school. It's just a part of growing up. It's a part of figuring out your identity, right? So you're putting your current values and beliefs on a situation which is probably not exactly representative of how you felt at the time. It's very misconstrued and misrepresented. So remember that. When you're constructing a memory and pulling that information out of the storage, it's constructive and not productive. Okay, we're trying to construct what happened. It's not a video camera we're playing back. If someone says that something happened a certain way and you don't remember it that way, that may be valid. Maybe you're misremembering. Maybe they're misremembering. Think of our memory sometimes when we're trying to pull it back. It's like an Instagram filter or a Snapchat filter. Some kind of lens we put over it. We can change and misconstrue how we present the story depending on how we want to sound. Maybe that movie Big Fish, it was back in the day. The dad always elaborated on the stories with such grandiosity. They were true on some level, but sometimes we elaborate them and skew them in our favor. So, it happens. It's a part of learning. So with learning and testing, time is also important when we talk about memory. There are certain amounts of time between learning and testing where things may go awry. So if you're learning material in your psychology class in the morning, and then you have your sociology class in the afternoon, there may be some mix-up between the content, so experiences can undermine memory in that time. So maybe you have a test 2 weeks out, and you all of a sudden can't remember which is psychology and which is sociology. That can happen with memory. We have what's called retroactive interference and proactive interference. So think of the memory, like retro, that antecedent. That's what's being interfered with. So when new information interferes with old information, this can be the misinformation effect, which I've included a slide for in your supplementary materials on this. It's the idea that the way we ask questions can be suggestive and change memories. Elizabeth Loftus did heavy research in this topic and kind of debunked some of the validity of eyewitness testimony in crime scenes. So if you're really into crime scenes and eyewitness testimonies, check out that supplementary resources folder. This is a misinformation effect. The way people phrase questions can make you change your answer, and you don't even know it. It's one of the criticisms of law enforcement today, among other things, but that's one of them. And then we have proactive interference. So past memories interfere with the encoding of new. So if any of y'all are taking Spanish, right, and English was your first language, you often find yourself having trouble learning the new language. That's because the grammar and everything that you've learned about English up until this point in your life is interfering with the new information coming in. Same thing as when you have an old computer password and you change it and you can't remember the new password, you keep typing in the old. That's proactive interference. All right, stay tuned for part 2. Sorry, I'm going to cut it off quickly here.